Much of what makes our Western culture so wonderful was brought here by Hispanic New Mexican or Manito migration from New Mexico in the last century. An oral history project called Following the Manito Trail is documenting the paths these families took in their search for work and opportunity. And modern-day Manitos follow the trail for much the same reasons. Project Director Vanessa Fonseca explains.
So what is the Manito Project?
So the project title is Following the Manito Trail, and it's an ethnographic project. It's both historical, it's art, it's culture, it's sort of everything wrapped into one. And it follows the migration path of New Mexicans who have left Wyoming in search of employment. And so the first place that we decided to focus on was Wyoming. Our co-project director, Levi Romero, has family who is from Riverton, Wyoming, and so we thought it would be a good idea to sort of start with that area. In 2006, he did a project with the University of New Mexico. He took a group of students from Albuquerque up through Colorado into Wyoming and did interviews with 10 people living in Cheyenne that are originally from New Mexico. So among those people were Ann Redmond, who runs the Wyoming Latina Youth Conference, and some other people. So the students really enjoyed the trip, and this was sort of the impetus for creating the larger project, not just focused on Wyoming, but sort of going out to the greater Southwest, looking at Arizona, Colorado. We know that there are lots of Manitos living in southern Colorado, and sometimes we like to say that northern New Mexico and southern Colorado are sort of not a state on its own, but sort of a region on its own, right? They have their own particular dialects of Spanish and their own cultural heritage that dates back to the 1500s. So that was really exciting for us to just sort of look at the individuals that have left New Mexico to come up to Wyoming starting in the 1850s as sheep herders. Many of them were famed sheep herders, so there's, New Mexico, I guess, is really famous for sheep herding. I didn't know that until I started looking at the research, but they came up to Wyoming and then over to California to work in the to work as sheep herders during the gold rush to provide a cheaper source of food for people working in the gold rush. Other than the sheep herding industry, you'll also find Manitos or New Mexican Hispanics working on the railroad or in the sugar beet fields, or the betabeles is what they call it in Spanish. So working in the sugar beet fields, but also working in the coal mines. And then you see this shift over time when those different industries no longer become sustainable for those individuals, and they come to areas like Laramie or Cheyenne to find employment, which are considered the more metropolitan areas of Wyoming, right? But interestingly enough, like you'll go into all these different communities. We've been to Riverton, we've been to Rawlins, we've been in Laramie, obviously, and then to Cheyenne. And there are particular neighborhoods where Manitos settled and where they continue to live. So for example, we were in Rawlins a couple weeks ago and we met with Jabari Martinez, who is the first Hispanic mayor in the state of Wyoming. And he took us through the south part of Rawlins, which was the Manito enclave. And so he was able to point out all the different families that settled in the areas. And then also talking about how these families have sort of moved on over time and how the neighborhood has shifted over time. So most of these families in Rawlins got there probably in the 1920s or 30s. And they've seen, multiple generations of Manito families in that neighborhood. But now, he laments that these families no longer live there, that they've moved on to other cities.
Has the Manito community have any effect on the sheep industry in Wyoming?
I think that it's very common for us to think about sheep herding in Wyoming as sort of like a Basque phenomenon. And while the Basque were very famed sheep herders, New Mexicans were even more so during a particular period of time. And so what we're actually doing next weekend is traveling to a part of southern Wyoming where there are a lot of arbor glyphs, and these are sheep carvings in aspens that have different depictions of when the Manitos traveled through those areas running the sheep. So it's kind of interesting. We have a professor, Troy Lovata, who's coming up from the University of New Mexico, who specializes in arbor glyph research. And so we're going to run around in the forest and try to find these aspen trees and photograph them so they can become part of our research.
And so what is an arbor glyph?
Arbor glyph is essentially just a carving in an aspen tree. And aspen trees have about, if you carve anything into an aspen tree, they have about a 100-year lifespan. So these carvings were in the 1920s, 1930s. So they're approaching the end of their lifespan in terms of like us being able to see them, but also the end of the lifespan for the tree itself. So we want to get out there before they disappear. And it's interesting to see what kind of carvings are on these trees. Sometimes you'll have like women in 1920s fashion on trees. Sometimes you have it just marking a path, right? So for them to be able to find their way back. And if you think about it, I mean, women are, it makes sense, right? Because they're going without companionship for so long. So it makes sense to just carve something into a tree to remind them of the women at home or whatever. Yeah.
So why is it important to document the Manito community, and have they been documented before?
The Manito community has been documented before, not in terms of diaspora though. And so Samuel Cisneros, who works at the Center for Southwest Research at the University of New Mexico, he wrote his master's thesis on the diaspora into northern Mexico after the Mexican-American War. So his research is really focused on like Chihuahua and areas around there where Manitos settled after 1848. But no one has done Manito diaspora north of New Mexico. And so there are some folk tales. In Utah, there was a book that came out last year called Latinos in Utah by Armando Solorzano. And so he talks about Manitos being the first community to settle in Utah in the 1800s. And so there is some documentation of it, but no in-depth documentation. And if you look at census research, you'll see that there were a lot of New Mexicans who came up to Wyoming to work in these different industries, but you don't have sort of this nuanced information about them, right? It's just they were here, this was their family, this is how many kids they had, and this is where they worked, right? So by going to these research centers like the Center for Southwest Research, or by engaging in our own research, we're able to find, you know, these folk tales and these oral histories that were conducted in the 1970s that give us more information about the lives of these individuals beyond just census data.
Why is that an important aspect of our culture?
I think that for Wyoming, we tend to think about immigration and migration to Wyoming by Hispanics or Latinos as a recent phenomenon. And so we think, you know, there's sort of this scare, you know, that Mexicans are going to take over, right? But the fact of the matter is that Mexican Americans have been in Wyoming for a very long time, right? So I think a lot of it is looking at the ways in which Manito communities have shaped the state of Wyoming over time. So if we think about Dwyer Martinez as the first Hispanic mayor, I think this didn't happen until the 1980s, even though Manitos had been here for 100 years before that. Or Ann Redmond, who started the Wyoming Latina Youth Conference, right? So we're recognizing that Latinos are growing in the state of Wyoming, but there has to be individuals who are invested in those communities to be able to help them grow and empower them in different ways.
And the last question, and I didn't ask in the beginning, what is Manito? Why Manito?
Manito is a term, so there are different variations for it. My grandmother used to use it, but Manito comes from hermano, which is then cut down to mano, which is then cut down to manito, right? So it's an endearing term that people use to refer to each other. Typically in northern New Mexico, but my grandmother has recollections of this happening in northwestern New Mexico, which is not like the prototypical like north when we think about it in New Mexico. So she remembers just referring to people as that, but also if you think about field workers and this idea of, you know, referring to each other as that, and then the patrones or the bosses would then use it as a diminutive term or a derogatory term to refer to these individuals. So it just depends on who you ask, but I think of it more as an endearing term and just a way of like creating a collective identity between these Hispanic New Mexicans.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, absolutely.